Did you know that the walls of the old asylum still whisper the tales of those who once walked its halls? That was the line that started it all. It came from Trevor, always the one to push boundaries, his grin wide as we sat around the campfire. It was late, well past midnight, and the crackling firelight danced on his face, casting long shadows that flickered like ghosts themselves. We all knew the place he was talking about, Thornwood Asylum. It had stood abandoned on the edge of town for as long as any of us could remember. A looming, decrepit monument to a dark history most people preferred not to talk about. "It's just an old building," Sarah scoffed, but I could see the unease in her eyes. None of us could shake the stories. The place had once housed hundreds of patients, and not all of them had left. There were rumors of cruel experiments, locked rooms, and screams in the dead of night. The town treated it like a scar best forgotten, yet it was impossible to ignore. "I say we go check it out, tonight," Trevor added, the challenge clear in his voice. The group fell silent. No one wanted to admit they were scared. I glanced at Jack, my best friend since elementary school. He shrugged, the same look of trepidation on his face that mirrored mine. But we couldn't back down, not in front of Trevor. "I'm in," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. One by one, the others agreed, though Sarah hesitated until the last second. She was the most practical of us, but she wasn't going to sit this one out and leave us to mock her for being afraid. So with flashlights in hand and a sense of excitement masking our growing fear, we set off toward the asylum. The closer we got, the more oppressive the night felt. Thornwood Asylum was massive, its towering, vine-covered walls stretching into the darkness like the bones of some long-dead giant. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around our feet as we stood before the rusted iron gates. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I wasn't sure if it was from the night air or something else entirely. "You guys sure about this?" Sarah asked one last time, her voice wavering. "Too late to turn back now," Trevor replied, grinning as he pushed open the gate with a loud, screeching creak. As we stepped through, I swear I heard it, a faint, distant whisper, like someone was calling from inside the asylum. The gate clanged shut behind us with an unsettling finality, the echo hanging in the air longer than it should have. I paused for a moment, my heart racing in my chest, straining my ears to hear if the others had caught the whisper too. But Trevor was already striding forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog like a blade. "Let's move. It's just an old building," Trevor said over his shoulder, his voice casual, though there was something too eager in his steps. I stayed near the back, walking alongside Sarah and Jack. Sarah clutched her flashlight in a death grip, her knuckles white. Did you hear that?" she whispered to me, her eyes wide. I nodded but didn't say anything. I didn't want to feed into the tension hanging over us. Maybe it was the wind or the creaking old building. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. The asylum loomed larger as we approached, its broken windows like empty eyes watching our every step. The front door, a massive oak thing, was slightly ajar, its once grand carvings now worn away by years of neglect. Trevor reached it first and, without hesitating, pushed it open with a long groan that sent shivers down my spine. The air that greeted us was stale, heavy with dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic, like old blood. We stepped inside, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The foyer was vast and decayed, with peeling wallpaper and mold crawling up the walls. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and a grand staircase stretched up into the blackness of the second floor. Everything about the place screamed, "Stay out!" But here we were, standing in the belly of the beast. "Smells like something died in here," Jack muttered, wrinkling his nose. "It's just mold and rot," Trevor said dismissively, though even he seemed more subdued now that we were actually inside. His bravado from earlier had started to wane. As we moved further in, our footsteps echoed unnervingly through the empty halls. Each step seemed louder than the last, the sound bouncing off the crumbling walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where the noise was coming from. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. I tapped it a few times, and the light blinked back on, but the damage was done. My nerves were already shot. "Maybe we should stick together," Sarah suggested, her voice shaking slightly. "Agreed," Jack said quickly, glancing at me as if for reassurance. I nodded. The place felt like it was watching us, and none of us wanted to be alone. We moved through the main hallway, passing closed doors that led to who knows where. Each one seemed to radiate a strange energy, as if something or someone was waiting on the other side. I couldn't help but glance at them nervously as we passed, imagining the horrors that might lie behind those rotting wood panels. Suddenly, Trevor stopped in his tracks. "Guys, look at this!" He was pointing at a door slightly ajar at the end of the hall. Faint, flickering light was seeping out from the crack, like an old lantern struggling to stay lit. My heart leaped into my throat. There was no power in this place, and no one was supposed to be here. We were supposed to be the only ones inside. "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, taking a step back. Trevor, of course, grinned. "Looks like we're not alone after all." But there was no humor in his voice this time, just a strange, tense excitement. Without waiting for the rest of us, he stepped forward, pushing the door open. Inside was a small room, and in the center of it, a single flickering candle set on a rusted metal table. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, like we had just interrupted something that wasn't meant to be seen. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us with a loud bang, and the candle went out. The darkness swallowed us whole, a suffocating blanket that snuffed out the little courage I had left. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could hear the others scrambling in the pitch black. Someone's flashlight hit the ground with a loud clatter, followed by Sarah's sharp gasp. "Who closed the door?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "No one touched it," Jack muttered, his voice tight with fear. He was fumbling with his flashlight, but the beam wouldn't flicker back on. Mine was dead too, the light refusing to respond, no matter how hard I pressed the switch. Okay, everyone just stay calm," Trevor said, though I could hear the cracks in his usual bravado. "It's probably just the wind or something. We'll get out of here in no time." I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that we were trapped in this room, or the fact that I didn't believe a word of what Trevor was saying. There was no breeze. No wind had slammed that door shut. As we stood there, enveloped in the thick silence, I started to hear it. Soft at first, like the rustling of fabric or the gentle brush of someone moving nearby. Then it grew louder, clearer, whispers, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper himself. We all heard it. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like the walls themselves were alive, murmuring secrets just out of reach, secrets we had no business hearing. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave." "I'm trying," Trevor barked, his hands fumbling at the door handle, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck. It won't open." I backed up, my spine pressing against the cold wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and my skin crawled with the feeling that someone was watching us from the shadows. I turned my head, half expecting to see a figure looming in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the oppressive, suffocating blackness that surrounded us. Then the whispers stopped. For a moment, it was silent, so quiet that I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thudding of my heart. I glanced at the others. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear. Her lips parted as if she was about to say something. But before she could, a loud crash erupted from the far corner of the room. Something heavy hit the floor, the sound echoing through the small space like a gunshot. I jumped, my blood freezing in my veins. "What the hell was that?" Jack cried out, shining his now functioning flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on a rusted metal chair, which had toppled over on its own. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention. It was what was beneath it. Scrawled on the dusty floor in thick, dark letters, like someone had etched it with a trembling hand, were the words, asterisk, asterisk, leave or die. My throat went dry. "We need to go, now," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Trevor stopped fiddling with the door handle and took a step back, his face pale in the dim light. "All right, let's not panic. We're getting out of here." Jack turned, ready to grab the handle himself, but as he reached for it, the whispers started again, louder this time, angrier. I felt something brush past my arm, cold and fleeting, like icy fingers skimming my skin. I jerked away, instinctively swiping at the air, but there was nothing there. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. The hallway outside was bathed in an eerie glow, a light that hadn't been there before. None of us moved for a long moment, unsure whether to trust what we were seeing. We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Trevor nodded, his bravado completely gone. Without another word, he led the way out into the hall. The strange light flickered above us, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The whispers had stopped again, but the feeling that something or someone was following us was impossible to shake. As we made our way down the corridor, our footsteps echoed louder than they should have, as if there were more than just the four of us walking. And then, from somewhere far behind us, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. "Don't look back," Trevor said, his voice strained with fear. "Just keep walking." But I couldn't help it. I turned my head ever so slightly, my eyes catching a glimpse of movement in the darkness. Someone, or something, was standing at the end of the hall. I couldn't breathe. My heart stuttered in my chest as my eyes locked onto the shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall and gaunt, its outline barely visible in the flickering light. But there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was watching us. "I told you not to look," Trevor muttered through clenched teeth. His voice was a low growl, more panicked than angry. I snapped my head forward again, refusing to glance back. My pulse thundered in my ears, and each step felt heavier, like the air itself was pushing against me, trying to slow us down. The others must have sensed it too, because our pace quickened, our feet shuffling faster across the broken floor. Behind us, the footsteps returned, louder now, deliberate, matching our own, but slightly out of sync. Whoever, or whatever it was getting closer. "Keep moving," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with a desperation I hadn't heard before. We hurried forward, turning into another long corridor that stretched into darkness. The asylum seemed like a maze, with each hallway identical to the last. The walls here were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, the kind that might have once been cheerful, but now looked sickly and decayed. There were more doors, some hanging off their hinges, others sealed shut with rusted chains. Every room seemed to be hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being funneled deeper into the asylum, like there was no way out. The further we went, the more the temperature dropped. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and the icy air stung my skin. "We're going in circles," Jack said, his voice hoarse. He was right. The hallways were becoming eerily familiar. It felt like no matter where we turned, we ended up back in the same place, with the same rusted doors and decayed walls. "Just keep moving," Trevor muttered again, though his confidence had long since vanished. His hand was shaking as he gripped his flashlight, the beam jittering against the floor. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We all froze in place, our breath held in tense silence. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway behind us. The figure was gone. The hallway stretched on into empty darkness. "Maybe it left," Sarah whispered, though her words sounded more like a question than a statement. "Don't kid yourself," Jack muttered. He sounded shaken, more than I'd ever seen him before. "It's still here, watching." I felt it too, an overwhelming sense of being observed, like the walls had eyes, waiting for us to make a wrong move. It wasn't just a figure. This place, it was alive in its own sick way. We kept walking, our pace slower now, as if expecting something to jump out at us any second. My mind raced. The stories we'd heard, the rumors about Thornwood, maybe they weren't just tales passed down to scare kids. Maybe this place was as haunted as they said, and we were the latest group of fools to venture too far. Suddenly, the lights above us flickered again. The weak bulbs buzzed like dying insects, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I felt something brush against my arm, a light, cold touch, like a hand, but when I turned, nothing was there. Then, as if from nowhere, the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor echoed down the hall behind us. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted us to hear it approaching. Sarah whimpered, her eyes wide with terror, her flashlight shaking in her grip. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Something's playing with us." The scraping grew louder, closer, accompanied by a soft rhythmic tapping. I couldn't make out what it was, but it sent chills racing down my spine. Whatever it wasn't in any rush. It wanted us to feel it coming. "Run," Trevor said, his voice trembling. And we did. We took off down the hall, our footsteps pounding against the crumbling floor. The sound of scraping and tapping followed us, growing louder, more aggressive. My legs burned as I pushed myself to run faster, my heart slamming in my chest. Sarah was ahead of me, her breath coming in panicked gasps, and Jack was close behind, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. We rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it. A door. A different door. Not like the others we'd passed. This one was newer, untouched by the decay of the rest of the asylum. It looked solid, almost inviting. "Get to the door!" I shouted, pointing at it. Trevor reached it first, grabbing the handle and yanking it open with more force than necessary. We stumbled through, slamming it behind us just as the scraping sound reached the corner. For a moment there was silence. We were in a small, dimly lit room, the walls lined with old filing cabinets and dusty medical charts. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and age, but for the first time since we entered, it felt like we'd found some kind of refuge. But then, as I caught my breath, I noticed something off. In the corner of the room, a figure stood. It was dressed in a filthy hospital gown, its face obscured by matted hair and shadows. It hadn't been there when we first entered. And now it was moving. Time seemed to stop as we stared at the figure in the corner. The dim light barely illuminated the figure, but what I could make out made my stomach churn. It stood unnaturally still, its head slightly tilted, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. The hospital gown it wore was stained with dark, dried streaks, its edges frayed and tattered. Beneath the long, matted hair, I could see pale, lifeless skin. No one moved. No one even breathed. The air in the room felt thick, like we were sinking into it, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Who is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder would make the figure notice us. "I don't know," Trevor responded, his voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here. Slowly." He was right, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but something about the way the figure stood, so silent, so still, made me terrified that any sudden movement might set it off. Jack, standing closest to me, took a small step back, his foot scuffed against the floor, making the faintest sound. That was all it took. The figure moved. Its head jerked toward us, the sudden motion unnatural and jerky, like it hadn't moved in years. The strands of greasy hair fell away from its face, revealing pale, hollow eyes. But there was something worse than the emptiness in those eyes. There was recognition, like it had been waiting for us. Then it took a step forward, slow and deliberate, dragging its bare feet across the cold floor with a soft, sickening shuffle. A low, guttural sound escaped from its throat, something between a growl and a moan. a sound that seemed to come from deep inside the hollow of its chest. "Run," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. We bolted for the door. Trevor yanked it open, and we scrambled out, slamming it shut behind us. But as soon as the door closed, we heard it, a heavy thud against the wood, followed by that same dragging shuffle. The figure wasn't done with us. It was coming. "Move!" Trevor shouted, and we sprinted down the hall, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster. The asylum felt like it was closing in around us, the walls narrowing, the ceilings lowering, like the building itself wanted to trap us. Behind us, the sound of the dragging footsteps echoed through the corridor, faster now, more insistent. Whatever it was gaining on us. "This way," Sarah cried, pointing to a side door at the end of the hall. We swerved toward it, crashing through the door into another long, dark hallway. The air was even colder here, each breath stinging my lungs as we ran. I could hear it behind us, the footsteps, but there was something else now too. Whispers, faint but distinct, like voices trapped between worlds, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. "What the hell is happening?" Jack gasped, his face pale with fear. No one answered. We were too terrified to stop, too consumed by the nightmare we'd stumbled into. The hallways twisted and turned, and every time we thought we'd lost it, the footsteps returned, slow but steady, like it was toying with us. Finally, we rounded a corner and stumbled into what looked like an old treatment room. The walls were lined with dusty medical equipment, and the smell of disinfectant lingered faintly in the air, a sharp contrast to the decay around us. "Close the door," I said, breathless. Trevor shoved the door shut and dragged a heavy metal cabinet in front of it for good measure. We stood there panting, each of us trying to catch our breath. But the room felt no safer than the halls. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then I noticed something strange. There were words scrawled on the walls, faint and almost invisible in the dim light. I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating the faded writing. It was written in a shaky hand, the letters uneven and frantic. "They're still here," I read aloud. My voice echoed in the small room, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "They never left." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes wide. "What does that mean? Who's still here?" Before anyone could respond, there was a loud bang against the door. Something was pounding on it now, harder than before. The metal cabinet rattled as the force increased, and I could hear that low, guttural moan again, muffled but unmistakable. "We can't stay here," Jack whispered, his face pale and drawn. "It's going to break through." The pounding grew louder, more frantic, as if the figure outside knew we were trapped. I could feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet with each thud, and the air felt thick with the weight of impending doom. Then the whispers started again, but this time they weren't faint. They were loud and clear, coming from the walls around us. Voices, dozens of them. They seemed to be speaking to us, warning us. "Leave," one voice hissed. "Get out," another whispered. But there was no way out, not this time. The voices surrounded us, growing louder with every passing second, filling the room with an eerie chorus of whispers. They were coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath our feet. It was like the asylum itself was alive, urging us to leave, or worse, taunting us, knowing there was nowhere for us to go. The pounding on the door intensified, the metal cabinet rattling as someone, threw themselves against it with increasing force. The door wasn't going to hold for long, and the thought of that silent figure breaking through made my blood run cold. Trevor stood frozen, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah backed away from the door, clutching her flashlight like it was a lifeline, her face pale as the voices swirled around us. Jack was the only one who seemed to be thinking clearly. He moved toward the far wall, scanning for another exit, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "There's gotta be another way out," he muttered, his voice tense with desperation. "This place is too big. There has to be more than one door." I joined him, frantically searching the walls, but all we found were rows of old medical equipment, rusted beyond recognition, and shelves filled with dust-covered charts and files. No windows, no hidden doors. Just the oppressive feeling that we were trapped. "We can't stay here," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "It's going to get in, and we'll be trapped." "Shut up," Trevor snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm trying to think." But there was no time to think. The door shuddered violently as another loud bang rang out, this time accompanied by the sound of splintering wood. Whatever was outside was getting through, and fast. "Over here!" Jack called suddenly, pointing toward the back corner of the room. His flashlight had landed on a narrow, half-hidden door behind a row of rusted metal shelves. It was smaller than the other doors, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, but it was something. We didn't need to be told twice. Jack was already moving the shelves out of the way as the rest of us scrambled to help. Dust and cobwebs flew into the air as we shoved the shelves aside, revealing the old, creaky door behind them. "Hurry!" Sarah urged, her voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers and the relentless pounding on the main door. Trevor was the first to reach the door. He yanked it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading downward. The smell that wafted up from the steps was damp and moldy, but it was our only option. Without hesitation, he descended into the darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he moved. "Go!" Jack urged, pushing me toward the stairs. Sarah followed close behind, and I glanced back at the door just as the cabinet gave way, crashing to the floor with a deafening clatter. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and through the widening crack, I could see movement, a pale, shadowy figure, pushing its way inside. I didn't wait to see what it looked like up close. I bolted down the stairs after the others, my flashlight flickering as the darkness swallowed us whole. The stairs were narrow and steep, winding downward in what felt like a never-ending spiral. The walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and rot. My foot slipped on the slick steps more than once, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed us down, growing fainter the deeper we went, but they never fully disappeared. They clung to the walls, echoing in the tight space, as if they were a part of the building itself. When we finally reached the bottom, we stumbled into what looked like an old underground corridor. The air was colder here, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of water that squelched under our shoes. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, some of them dripping steadily, and there was a faint, rhythmic clanking sound in the distance, like machinery long forgotten. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She shined her flashlight down the corridor, but it seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the darkness. "It's like a basement," Jack said, catching his breath. "Or maybe an old maintenance tunnel." "It doesn't matter," Trevor muttered, his voice hollow. "We need to keep moving." We started down the corridor, our footsteps splashing in the shallow water. The further we went, the more oppressive the air became. I could feel it pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The voices had faded to a low murmur, but that didn't bring any comfort. In fact, it felt worse, like something was waiting for us down here. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, her flashlight beam frozen on a spot ahead of us. "Guys, look!" I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, at the far end of the corridor, was another door. This one was metal, old and rusted, with a large, faded sign bolted to the front. The letters were barely legible, worn away by time and decay, but I could still make out a single word. Asterisk, asterisk, morgue. Asterisk, asterisk. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. "We're not going in there. No way." "We don't have a choice," Jack said grimly, though his face was pale. "We can't go back." Trevor stepped forward, his flashlight illuminating the door. He reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, a loud, echoing bang rang out from the other side. We all froze. There was something on the other side of that door, and it was waiting for us. The echo of the bang lingered in the corridor, the sound bouncing off the walls and amplifying in the damp, enclosed space. No one moved, no one spoke, but I could feel the tension gripping all of us like a vice. My heart hammered in my chest, my pulse throbbing in my ears. I didn't want to go any closer to that door, and yet we had nowhere else to go. "We can't go in there," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky and weak, like she was barely holding herself together. "We shouldn't." "We don't have a choice," Trevor muttered, his eyes fixed on the rusted door. I could tell he was terrified too, but his fear wasn't enough to stop him. Trevor reached for the handle, his fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. I wanted to shout at him to stop, to turn around, but the words died in my throat. A part of me knew he was right. Going back wasn't an option. Whatever was behind us was relentless, and the morgue door was the only path forward. With a loud creak, the door groaned open, the hinges shrieking in protest as it swung inward. A gust of frigid air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of death. It was sharp and metallic, mixed with the earthy staleness of decay, and it hit us like a wall, making my stomach turn. "God," Jack whispered, covering his mouth with his sleeve, trying to stifle his gag reflex. Trevor stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. I followed, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to get out. Sarah and Jack were close behind, their footsteps hesitant as they crossed the threshold into the morgue. The room was larger than I expected, the walls lined with metal drawers, the kind meant for holding bodies. Some of them were slightly ajar, as if disturbed recently, though the place had been abandoned for years. The ceiling dripped with condensation, the steady plink of water echoing through the silent space. "Let's just find a way out and get the hell out of here," Jack muttered, shining his flashlight around the room. But there were no obvious exits, no windows or additional doors. Just the rows of metal drawers, each one marked with numbers that had long since faded. Then, Trevor's flashlight caught something in the far corner, and we all turned to look. A single gurney stood in the center of the room, rusted and decayed, its thin mattress covered in a stained, yellowed sheet, and beneath that sheet, there was something moving. At first, it was just a small twitch, a subtle shift in the fabric that could have been the result of our imaginations. But then, the sheet rippled again, more distinctly this time, as if something underneath was trying to get out. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with terror. "Yeah," I whispered, my mouth dry. "We all did." Trevor took a step forward, his flashlight trained on the gurney. "There's nothing under there. It's just an old..." Before he could finish, the sheet flung itself off the gurney with a violent jerk, revealing a body, gray and shriveled, with deep, sunken eyes that stared up at us with a frozen, twisted expression of agony. Its chest was caved in, and the skin clung to its bones like it had been mummified by time. But it wasn't dead. The body's fingers twitched, and its head rolled to the side, the jaw creaking open in a grotesque, soundless scream. My blood ran cold as its empty, dead eyes focused on us. Sarah let out a scream, backing away so fast that she nearly tripped over one of the metal drawers behind her. Jack stood frozen, his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam jittering across the room. Trevor, for once, was silent. He stared at the body in shock, his bravado completely stripped away. What the hell is that?" The body began to move, its limbs jerking as it tried to sit up. The sound of cracking bones filled the air as it contorted unnaturally, like it hadn't moved in decades. Its movements were slow and stiff, but deliberate. "Run," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible, but the urgency in his tone was clear. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted for the door, but just as we reached it, a loud bang echoed through the room. The drawers lining the walls began slamming open, one by one. The metallic clang of each drawer hitting its stop reverberated through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something crawling out of them. I looked back and saw them. Bodies, more of them, decayed and grotesque, slowly pulling themselves out of the drawers. Their movements were slow, but the sight of their twisted, shriveled forms sent a wave of nausea and terror through me. "Go, go, go!" Trevor shouted, pushing Jack through the door. Sarah was already halfway down the hall, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. As I scrambled to follow, I heard the whispers again, louder this time, and more frantic. They were coming from everywhere, echoing in the small space like a swarm of voices, all speaking at once. But they weren't just whispers anymore. They were calling our names. "Get out!" Trevor screamed, as the sound of dragging bodies grew louder behind us. "Don't stop, just run!" We didn't stop. We ran through the narrow corridor, the cold air biting at our skin, the voices chasing us down the hall. Every step felt heavier, like something was pulling me back, trying to slow me down. But the voices wouldn't let up. They called our names again and again, their tone growing more urgent, more demanding. It was as if the spirits of the asylum wanted us to join them, to become part of whatever horrible fate had befallen them. Suddenly, the floor beneath me trembled, a deep rumbling vibration that seemed to come from the very foundation of the asylum. I stumbled, nearly falling, but Trevor grabbed my arm, pulling me back to my feet. "We're almost out," he gasped, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to keep moving." But as we rounded the next corner, we came face to face with another door. A locked door, and the whispers were getting closer. We rounded the corner, our feet pounding against the damp floor, only to come face to face with a heavy, rusted door. Jack reached for the handle, twisting and pulling with all his strength, but it didn't budge. "It's locked," Jack gasped, slamming his fist against the metal. His flashlight flickered, casting twisted shadows on the walls, the hallway seeming to narrow around us. The whispers were getting louder now, more insistent, like they were pressing in from all sides, closing the distance between us and whatever horror was following. My skin prickled as the air around us grew colder. "Find another way!" Sarah cried, her eyes darting around frantically. Her breath came out in ragged bursts, her flashlight shaking so badly that the beam jittered across the ceiling and walls. But there was no other way. The corridor stretched back into the darkness behind us, where the low, shuffling sound of something dragging itself along the floor grew louder. The thought of going back, of facing whatever was coming after us, made my chest tighten with fear. "We have to break it down," Trevor said, his voice strained with panic. He stepped forward and threw his shoulder against the door, the metal groaning under his weight, but refusing to give way. Jack joined him, and together they pounded on the door, desperate to force it open. I stood frozen for a moment, my flashlight aimed back toward the corridor we had just come from. The air felt thick and heavy, like the very atmosphere was pressing down on us. And then, through the darkness, I saw it. Movement. Shadows shifting at the far end of the hall. Something was coming. "Hurry!" I shouted, the urgency in my voice cutting through the thick tension. I could hear the whispers more clearly now, though the words were jumbled and distorted, as if they were coming from a place just beyond our understanding. It felt like the asylum was alive, and it wanted us. Trevor and Jack slammed against the door again, gritting their teeth, but it still wouldn't move. The door frame groaned, rust flakes falling to the floor, but it remained stubbornly shut. Then, without warning, the light above us flickered and went out. We were plunged into complete darkness, the only light coming from our flashlights, which now seemed painfully inadequate against the overwhelming blackness that surrounded us. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I could hear the fear in her words, and I felt it too, a growing sense of dread that told me we were running out of time. Suddenly, the door behind us shook violently, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the entire building seemed to groan in response. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now, filling my ears like a deafening chorus. They were everywhere. "We're not alone," Jack whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "We never were," Trevor replied, his voice hollow. As the door behind us trembled again, there was a loud creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of the lock snapping open. Trevor didn't wait. He yanked the door open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into the unknown. Without hesitation, we ran, each of us scrambling to get through the opening, the sound of whispers and dragging footsteps chasing us as we fled into the stairwell. I glanced back just once before the door slammed shut behind us. In the dim light of my fading flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something in the darkness. A pale figure at the far end of the hall, watching us with hollow eyes. But then the door was closed, and the sound of it slamming echoed up the narrow stairwell as we climbed, hoping against hope that whatever was down there wouldn't follow us. The echo of the door slamming behind us reverberated through the narrow stairwell, the sound bouncing off the cold stone walls. We were plunged into near silence, except for the heavy breathing and rapid footsteps of the group as we ascended, the only light coming from our flickering flashlights. The air was stifling in the cramped space, thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. It felt like they were rising with us, following us up each step, growing louder the higher we climbed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum itself was pulling us deeper into its twisted maze, like it didn't want us to leave. "Where does this even lead?" Jack gasped, his voice strained from the exertion of climbing. "No idea," Trevor muttered, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. "But we have to keep going. Whatever was down there isn't going to stop." The stairwell felt like it was spiraling endlessly upward, the steps steep and uneven. My legs ached, but I pushed through the pain, too terrified to stop. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see something, some shadowy figure creeping up behind us, dragging itself step by step. "Does this place even have an end?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It feels like we're not getting anywhere." Trevor didn't answer. He was focused on climbing, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed in determination. I could see the fear etched on his face, though he was trying hard to hide it. None of us wanted to admit it, but it felt like the asylum was toying with us, leading us in circles, making sure we never found a way out. As we rounded another bend in the staircase, I noticed something strange. The air was getting colder, unnaturally so, like we were walking into a freezer. My breath came out in small puffs of fog, and the chill seeped into my bones, making it hard to keep moving. "Guys, do you feel that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Yeah," Jack replied, his eyes wide. "It's freezing, all of a sudden." "What is this?" Trevor stopped in his tracks, his flashlight aimed at the steps ahead. "There's something up there," he said quietly, his voice low and tense. We all froze, our flashlights trained on the same spot. The stairs seemed to vanish into darkness, but beyond that, I could see something. An open doorway at the top of the staircase leading into another room. A faint pale light spilled out from the doorway, casting an eerie glow on the steps. "Do we go up?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have much choice," Trevor said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Let's move." One by one, we climbed the remaining steps, our flashlights flickering as the cold intensified. The doorway at the top grew closer, and with each step, I felt the dread building inside me. Something was waiting for us up there. I could feel it in my gut. When we finally reached the top, we stepped into the room cautiously. It was a large open space, but unlike the rest of the asylum, this room was different. The walls were pristine, free of decay and mold, and the floor was covered in old faded tiles. But what caught my attention the most was the light. It wasn't coming from any visible source. No lamps, no windows. It was just there, casting a dim, otherworldly glow that made the room feel like it existed outside of time. And then I saw them. Rows of beds perfectly lined up against the walls. The room looked like an old ward, but the beds were all empty, except for one. In the far corner, a single bed had its sheets pulled up to the headboard, as if someone had just left it. The sight of it made my skin crawl. "Is this some kind of hospital room?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she stepped further into the room, her eyes darting around. It looks like it, Jack replied, but there was hesitation in his voice, like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. I took a few steps toward the nearest bed, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown faint now, almost non-existent, but the silence was worse. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Something was about to happen. I could feel it. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Look, I whispered sharply, pointing toward the far side of the room. Trevor spun around, his flashlight beam landing on the same spot. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. But it was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt figure in a white gown, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching us. For a long moment, no one moved. We were all frozen, our eyes locked on the figure. And then, slowly, it took a step forward. "No!" Sarah breathed, backing away. "Not again!" We stumbled back toward the door, but before we could react, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. "Where did it go?" Jack whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," Trevor said, his voice low. "But we need to leave. Now." As we turned to head back down the stairwell, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, trapping us inside the room. And then the whispers returned, louder, more desperate than ever. The door slammed with such force that it shook the room, the sound echoing off the pristine walls. My heart leaped into my throat as I whirled around, staring at the heavy door that had sealed us in. There was no handle, no lock, just a solid, immovable slab of metal that now trapped us inside. The whispers, which had faded to the background moments before, surged back with an intensity that rattled my bones. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were urgent, frantic, surrounding us like a swarm of unseen voices. Each one layered on top of the other, overlapping in a way that made them impossible to understand, but impossible to ignore. "What do we do?" Sarah's voice cracked as she backed away from the door, her face pale. Her flashlight beam flickered weakly, the batteries clearly struggling. "We need to find another way out," Trevor said, his voice strained but steady. He was trying to hold it together, but even he looked shaken. "There's got to be something. A window, another door, something." But as I glanced around the room, it became clear how hopeless the situation was. The ward was eerily sterile compared to the rest of the asylum, but it was also devoid of any obvious exits. The rows of beds, once pristine, now looked like they had been abandoned for decades. The sheets on each bed were rumpled, as if whoever had been lying in them had left in a hurry, or worse, been dragged away. The single bed in the corner, the one with its sheets pulled back, drew my attention again. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. My eyes flicked to it, and a chill ran down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way the sheets were arranged, almost too precise, like someone, or something, had made the bed after its occupant left. "What if this is it?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced at the sealed door, his hands shaking. "What if we never get out?" "Don't say that," Trevor snapped, though there was little conviction in his voice. "We'll get out. We have to." But the room seemed to say otherwise. The longer we stood there, the more oppressive the air became, like the walls were closing in. The pale light that filled the room flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. My skin prickled with the uncomfortable sensation that we were being watched. "Look," Sarah whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the whispers. "The bed." I turned my head, slowly, dread filling my stomach. The bed in the corner, the one that had been neatly made, was no longer empty. A figure lay beneath the covers now, its body still, the outline of its form barely visible beneath the thin sheet. My mouth went dry. There was no way it had been there moments ago. We would have seen it. We would have heard it. How did that?" Jack stammered, his flashlight flickering as he aimed it at the bed. The beam landed on the figure's head where the pillow was slightly indented, as if something was lying there, unmoving. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away, her hand covering her mouth. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Trevor took a tentative step forward, his face pale but determined. "Stay back," he said to us, though his voice was shaking. "I'm going to check it out." "Are you crazy?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what that is." "I know," he replied, his eyes fixed on the figure. "But we can't just stand here and wait for something worse to happen." He shook off my grip and approached the bed slowly, his flashlight held out in front of him. Every step he took felt agonizingly long, the sound of his shoes scuffing against the floor the only noise in the room besides the whispers. When he reached the bed, he paused. His hand hovered above the sheet, his breathing shallow. Then with a quick motion, he yanked the sheet back. The bed was empty. Trevor stared at the vacant mattress, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to process what he was seeing. Or rather, what he wasn't seeing. "What the hell?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I swear there was something there." "There was," I said, my voice low, glancing around the room nervously. "We all saw it." Suddenly a loud creak came from behind us, the sound of metal scraping against the floor. We all spun around, our flashlights dancing across the room. One of the beds in the middle of the room was moving. The bed slowly slid across the floor, as if being pushed by an invisible force. My throat tightened, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But as the bed moved, I realized something else. The room had changed. It wasn't just the beds that were out of place. The walls had shifted too, the room itself warping in subtle ways, as if we were trapped inside some kind of living nightmare that was constantly reshaping itself. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now. I could almost make out the words, though they were jumbled, broken sentences that made no sense. Suddenly, Trevor grabbed me by the arm. "Look," he said, pointing to the far corner of the room. A new door had appeared. It wasn't there before, of that I was certain. It was smaller than the one we had come through, barely noticeable in the shadows. But it was open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway beyond. "That wasn't there," I said, shaking my head. "How is that possible?" "It doesn't matter," Trevor replied, his voice low. "It's our only way out." We didn't waste any time. One by one, we rushed toward the new door, our flashlights flickering wildly as we approached it. But as we reached the threshold, I hesitated, something gnawing at the back of my mind. Something didn't feel right. The whispers had stopped. The room had fallen silent, an eerie, unsettling stillness settling over the space. The beds were no longer moving, and the strange light that had filled the room was now flickering erratically. I glanced at the others, and they were all staring at the dark hallway with the same look of dread on their faces. But we had no choice. We stepped through the door, into the unknown. The moment we stepped through the new door, the temperature dropped even further, like we had walked into a void where the cold itself felt alive. The darkness on the other side of the door was different, thicker, more oppressive. Our flashlights barely penetrated it, their beams swallowed by the inky blackness that seemed to cling to us like a second skin. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the walls closing in like the ribs of some ancient creature. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the confined space, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence here was profound, and for a moment, I wished the whispers would return, just so I could hear something other than the pounding of my own heart. "Keep moving," Trevor whispered, his voice barely audible. He led the way, his shoulders tense, every step careful as if the ground might give way beneath us at any moment. I could tell he was trying to stay calm, but there was no hiding the fear in his voice anymore. We walked in a tight group, huddled together for some semblance of safety, but the farther we went, the more it felt like the shadows were watching us. Like they had eyes, waiting for us to make a mistake. "This place, it's not right," Sarah murmured, her voice shaking. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something creeping up behind us. "It doesn't feel like we're in the same building anymore." "We're not," Jack said grimly. "This isn't just an asylum. It's something else. Something wrong." I couldn't argue with that. The very air felt thick with an ancient, malevolent energy. The walls around us seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking, like they were breathing, alive in some way we couldn't understand. The floor beneath our feet felt slick, as if coated with a thin layer of something we didn't want to identify. "How much longer do we have to walk?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. It felt wrong to speak too loudly here, as if the shadows would swallow the sound. "I don't know," Trevor admitted, glancing at me, "but we can't go back. We have to keep going." Then, without warning, the corridor ahead of us split into two paths, each one disappearing into an impenetrable darkness. There were no markings, no signs, just two identical hallways stretching into the void. "Oh, which way?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. Trevor shined his flashlight down each path, but there was no way to tell which was the right one. Both looked the same, endless and foreboding. He bit his lip, indecision flickering across his face. "We stick together no matter what," he said finally. "Left. Let's go left." We turned down the left corridor, the air growing colder with each step. I could hear the sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance, but it was faint, barely audible over the sound of our breathing. The walls here were slick and damp, and the floor seemed to shift underfoot like it was covered in a thin layer of slime. Suddenly, a loud scraping sound echoed from behind us, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We all stopped in our tracks, our hearts hammering as we turned back toward the sound. "What was that?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Trevor replied, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "But we need to keep moving. Don't look back." We started walking faster, the tension between us palpable. The scraping sound followed us, growing louder with every step, as if whatever was behind us was getting closer. My stomach churned with fear, but I forced myself to keep going, not daring to look over my shoulder. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, movement in the shadows. Something darting along the walls, just at the edge of my vision. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but it was there. I wasn't imagining it. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Sarah, my voice shaking. "See what?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "The shadows. They're moving." As soon as I said it, the lights of our flashlights flickered, and for a brief second, the hallway plunged into total darkness. When the lights came back on, we were no longer alone. Shapes emerged from the shadows, pale and twisted, their forms barely human. They clung to the walls like shadows themselves, their long, gaunt fingers scraping against the stone as they crawled toward us. Their faces were featureless, just hollow indentations where eyes should have been. "Run!" Trevor shouted, but the panic in his voice told me everything I needed to know. We bolted down the corridor, our footsteps pounding against the slick floor, the sound of scraping and shuffling growing louder behind us. The shadow figures moved faster than I could have imagined, their limbs unnaturally long as they reached out toward us, their fingers brushing the edges of our clothes as we sprinted through the darkness. "Go, go, go!" Jack yelled, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, no end in sight. My lungs burned, my legs screaming for relief, but I didn't dare slow down. Up ahead, the walls began to narrow, closing in on us, the space becoming tighter and tighter. I could feel the shadows pressing closer, their cold fingers nearly at my back. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing ahead. A door, rusted and old, but a door nonetheless, was set into the wall just ahead of us. It was our only way out. We reached it together, Trevor slamming into the door with all his strength. It groaned under his weight but didn't budge. "Help me!" he shouted, and Jack and I threw our shoulders against the door. With one final heave, the door gave way, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The scraping stopped. The shadows were gone. For now. We collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, the cold air burning our lungs. The room we had entered was small and dark, the walls covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the stone that I couldn't begin to understand. "This isn't over," Trevor said, his voice hollow. "They're still coming." And as I looked around at the strange symbols surrounding us, a sense of dread washed over me. We weren't safe yet. The room was thick with an eerie silence, the kind that suffocates any hope of safety. Our gasps for breath seemed too loud, out of place in the dark, cramped space we just stumbled into. My flashlight flickered, casting weak beams of light onto the walls, revealing the strange markings etched into the stone. They weren't just random scratches or graffiti. They felt deliberate, ancient, purposeful, and menacing. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she scanned the walls with wide eyes. She moved closer to one of the symbols, hesitating as if even getting near them would invite something terrible. The markings covered every inch of the walls, curling in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. Each symbol was carved deep into the stone, and though I couldn't understand their meaning, they felt wrong, like they were meant to contain something dangerous. Jack shined his flashlight on a larger, more complex symbol near the center of the room. "These are old, really old," he muttered, almost to himself. "I've seen drawings like this before, but not like this." "Seen them where?" I asked, glancing around nervously. The walls seemed to press in closer the longer I stared at the carvings, like the room was alive and aware of us. "In books," Jack answered, though he didn't sound confident. "Ancient stuff. Some of these symbols are protective, meant to ward off things, but some of them, they're meant to trap." "Trap what?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering as her eyes darted from one symbol to another. "I don't know," Jack admitted, stepping away from the wall. "But whatever it is, we're standing right in the middle of it." Trevor, who had been quiet up until now, moved toward the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Look," he said, kneeling down. His flashlight beam revealed a large circular symbol carved into the stone beneath our feet. It was more elaborate than the others, with sharp, jagged lines radiating outward like a sunburst, but twisted and sinister. "That doesn't look good," I muttered, my stomach churning. The sight of that symbol made my skin crawl. There was something dark about it, something that felt more dangerous than the rest of the markings in the room. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, backing away from the center of the room. "Whatever this is, I don't want to find out what it's supposed to hold." "Agreed," Trevor said, standing up quickly. "But where do we go?" There was only one door, the one we had just slammed shut, and whatever was out there still felt like it was waiting for us in the shadows. I glanced at the strange symbols again, feeling a creeping unease as my eyes lingered on the circular carving beneath our feet. Something about this place wasn't right, but it was better than whatever was chasing us. "Do you hear that?" Jack suddenly asked, his voice low and tense. We all went silent, straining to listen. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, faintly at first, but growing louder, we heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from behind the walls, as if something was moving through the very stone, searching for a way in. Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here! It's still following us!" The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side of the walls was getting closer. The room itself seemed to vibrate with the sound, the symbols on the walls almost pulsating in time with the noise. "How do we stop it?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "What if these symbols are the only thing keeping it out?" Jack stared at the markings, his mind racing. Maybe these symbols are keeping us safe, but they're also keeping us trapped." Trevor stepped toward the door, his jaw set with determination. "We can't stay in here. Whatever's out there might be worse, But staying here isn't an option. We've got to risk it. The tapping intensified, now more of a banging, like something was slamming against the walls. The stone trembled, dust falling from the ceiling as cracks began to spiderweb across the surface. "Go!" Jack shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We don't have time!" Trevor threw open the door, and we bolted out into the hallway, the darkness swallowing us once more. The moment we stepped out, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before, swirling around us like a thick, suffocating fog. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, desperate to pull us deeper into its labyrinth. We ran, our flashlights cutting through the gloom, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning with no end in sight. The banging continued behind us, now echoing through the halls as if the very walls were trying to break free of whatever had been trapped inside them. Suddenly, the corridor split again, this time into 3 paths. Each one seemed darker and more foreboding than the last, but there was no time to hesitate. "Which way?" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Trevor hesitated for a moment, then pointed to the middle path. "This way. It feels right." Without another word, we plunged down the center hallway, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to shift as we passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following us, lurking, just out of sight. We rounded a corner, and suddenly the floor beneath us gave way. I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet, and before I could even scream, we were falling, plunging into the darkness below. The fall seemed to last forever, the weightless sensation twisting my stomach as we plunged into the darkness. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning wildly through the air before vanishing into the void. I could hear the others yelling, their voices distorted by the rush of air as we tumbled deeper and deeper. The blackness swallowed everything, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we would never stop falling. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, I hit the ground. Pain shot up my legs as I landed awkwardly on a hard surface. The impact knocked the wind out of me, leaving me gasping as I lay there disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Is everyone okay?" I croaked, my voice hoarse as I struggled to sit up. My entire body ached, but nothing felt broken, at least not yet. "I'm here." Jack's voice came from somewhere to my left, shaky but alive. "I think I'm okay." "I'm fine," Sarah murmured, though her voice sounded far from steady. "What just happened?" Trevor groaned from the other side of me, his flashlight flickering weakly as he dragged himself to his feet. "We fell," he said, stating the obvious, his voice laced with frustration. "But how far?" I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the overwhelming darkness. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, and the others' beams were dim and fading. As my vision cleared, I realized we were in some kind of vast underground chamber, the walls stretching up so high they disappeared into the gloom above us. The air was damp and stale, thick with the smell of earth and decay. This isn't just the basement," Jack muttered, shining his flickering flashlight around. "We've gone deeper. Much deeper." Sarah's flashlight illuminated something on the far wall, a massive stone structure, ancient and weathered, with more of those strange symbols carved into its surface. The markings glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an eerie greenish hue over the room. "Are those the same symbols?" I asked, dread creeping up my spine as I approached the wall. I could feel the weight of the symbols pressing down on us, like they were holding something terrible in place. "They're similar," Jack said, his brow furrowed as he examined the carvings more closely. "But they're older, much older." Trevor turned to me, his face pale in the faint light. "What is this place?" His voice cracked, the fear in him now undeniable. "Why is it here beneath the asylum?" As if in response to his question, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, vibrating the ground beneath our feet. The symbols on the wall pulsed, glowing brighter for a brief moment before dimming again. My heart skipped a beat. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, taking a step back. Whatever this is, it's been buried for a reason. She was right. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but there was no clear way out. The chamber was vast and seemingly endless, with no obvious exits, just the looming stone wall and the strange ancient carvings that seemed to thrum with a life of their own. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, we heard it, a faint, distant sound, like the shuffling of feet across the stone floor. "Do you hear that?" Jack whispered, his voice barely above a breath. We all froze, straining to listen. The sound was getting louder, more distinct. It wasn't just shuffling, it was dragging. Something heavy was being pulled across the ground, slow and deliberate. "Something's coming," Trevor muttered, his voice tight with fear. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the noise grew louder, closer. My mind raced. There was no way out, no place to hide. We were trapped, deep underground, with something that had no intention of letting us leave. The chamber grew colder, the air so thick I could barely breathe. The symbols on the walls pulsed again, their sickly green light flickering like a dying flame. Whatever was coming, it was tied to this place, tied to the symbols that covered every inch of the ancient stone. "Get behind the wall," I whispered urgently, motioning for the others to follow. "We need to hide." We scrambled toward the far side of the chamber, ducking behind the large stone structure as the dragging sound grew unbearably loud. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the cold stone, the fear in my chest swelling with each passing second. Then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the gloom, slowly emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head hanging at an unnatural angle. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, gray and decayed, as if it had been buried for centuries. But it wasn't just its appearance that made my blood run cold. It was the way it moved, its body jerking and twitching, as if it wasn't in control of itself. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures appeared, each one just as twisted and grotesque, dragging themselves forward with agonizing slowness. Their hollow eyes stared blankly ahead, their mouths open in silent screams. Sarah let out a quiet gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she tried to stifle the sound. But it was too late. The lead figure's head snapped toward us, its hollow eyes locking onto our hiding spot. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air grew impossibly cold, and the symbols on the walls pulsed in response, glowing brighter than ever. Then, with a guttural growl, the creature lurched toward us, its twisted limbs propelling it forward with unnatural speed. "Run!" Trevor screamed, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. The creature lunged at us with horrifying speed, its bony limbs creaking and snapping as it closed the distance between us in seconds. My legs felt like they were frozen in place, terror rooting me to the spot. The guttural growl it emitted seemed to rattle the very air around us, the sound reverberating through the vast chamber. "Move!" Trevor shouted, yanking me by the arm just as the creature's claw-like hand swiped through the space where I had been standing. We bolted from our hiding spot, the others close behind, as the chamber seemed to echo with the scraping, dragging sounds of more creatures joining the chase. The chamber felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in as more of the grotesque figures emerged from the shadows, their twisted forms dragging themselves toward us. There was nowhere to go, no way out. The ancient carvings on the walls pulsed brighter now, like they were alive, reacting to the presence of the creatures. I risked a glance behind me and immediately wished I hadn't. The lead creature was gaining on us, its long limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Its hollow eyes were locked onto me, its mouth open in a soundless scream that sent chills down my spine. "We can't outrun them," Jack shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Then what do we do?" Sarah cried, her voice cracking. She stumbled but managed to keep running, her flashlight barely illuminating the ground in front of her. I scanned the chamber desperately, looking for anything that could help us, and then I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, Hidden in the shadows was another door. It was barely visible, almost blending into the stone walls, but it was there, a potential escape. "There!" I shouted, pointing toward the door. "Head for that door!" Trevor saw it too and nodded, his face pale with fear. "Go, go, go!" he urged, pushing us forward as we raced across the chamber. The creatures behind us seemed to sense our plan. Their guttural growls grew louder, more frantic, as they scrambled after us, their skeletal limbs clawing at the ground with unnatural speed. I could feel them closing in, the cold air pressing against my back as their foul breath filled the space around us. We reached the door just as the lead creature was almost upon us. Trevor slammed into the door with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, rusted from centuries of disuse. He threw his weight against it again, gritting his teeth in frustration. "Help me!" he shouted, glancing back at the creature that was now only feet away. Jack and I rushed to his side, throwing our shoulders against the door. It groaned under the pressure, but still didn't give. The cold, rancid breath of the creatures was right behind us, and I could hear their claws scraping the ground, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Come on!" Sarah cried, her voice filled with desperation. She was holding her flashlight in both hands, ready to swing it like a weapon if necessary. With one final heave, the door finally gave way, swinging open with a loud creak. We tumbled inside, slamming it shut just as the creatures reached the threshold. Their claws scratched at the door, the wood shaking under the force of their blows, but for now, it held. We collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, the cold air of the chamber still clinging to us. My heart raced in my chest, and every inch of my body ached from the terror of the chase. "Are we safe?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was shaking, her flashlight flickering weakly in her hands. "I don't know," Trevor replied, his face pale as he pressed his ear against the door, listening for the creatures. Their scratching continued for a few more moments, but then it stopped. Silence fell over the room, an oppressive silence that felt like the calm before a storm. I took a deep breath and finally looked around the room we had stumbled into. It was smaller than the previous chamber, the walls lined with old, rusted equipment and shelves filled with strange, ancient artifacts. But what caught my eye was the centerpiece of the room, a large stone altar in the center, covered in more of those glowing symbols. "This place," Jack muttered, his voice shaking. "It's some kind of ritual room." Sarah stepped closer to the altar, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "What kind of ritual?" I had no answer, but the symbols etched into the stone seemed to hum with energy, glowing brighter as we stood near them. There was something ancient and powerful about this place, something dark that had been hidden for centuries. It felt like we were standing in the heart of the Asylum's secret. "These symbols," Jack said, stepping closer to the altar. "They're more than just warnings. They're instructions." "Instructions for what?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Trevor moved closer, his eyes scanning the carvings. "For an awakening." Before any of us could react, the room began to tremble, the walls vibrating as the ground beneath our feet shifted. The symbols on the altar pulsed, their glow growing stronger and more erratic. It felt like the entire room was coming to life, responding to something ancient and terrible. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, backing away from the altar. As if in answer, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, a voice that didn't belong to any of us. It was low, guttural, and filled with an ancient malice. "You have come too far. You cannot leave." Asterisk, asterisk. The altar cracked open, and from the depths of the stone, something began to rise. The altar split with a thunderous crack, the sound reverberating through the chamber like the growl of a waking beast. We stumbled back as the air around us seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating. The symbols etched into the stone flared with an intense, blinding light, flickering wildly as if something inside them was fighting to escape. From the shattered altar, a dark mist began to rise, thick, swirling, and unnatural. It moved with a purpose, not dissipating like normal fog, but coiling and twisting as if it were alive, searching for something. It pulsed with a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl, and the cold in the room became almost unbearable. What? What is that? Sarah stammered, her eyes wide with terror as she backed away from the mist, her flashlight shaking in her hands. I don't know, but we need to leave now, Trevor shouted, his voice panicked. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her back toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The heavy wooden door that had just saved us moments ago was now sealed tight, as if the asylum itself refused to let us leave. The mist spread quickly, slithering across the floor and reaching out toward us like tendrils of shadow. Wherever it touched, the stone beneath it cracked and decayed, the ancient markings on the walls dimming as the mist consumed them. We're trapped, Jack yelled, pounding on the door in desperation. It's not opening. Try the other way, I shouted, pointing to the far side of the room. There has to be another exit. But as we turned, the mist shifted, swirling toward us with terrifying speed. It moved like it had a mind of its own, cutting off our path and forcing us back toward the center of the room. The temperature continued to drop, the air so cold that it burned with every breath. The deep, guttural voice echoed again, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You have awakened what should have stayed buried. Now there is no escape. Asterisk, asterisk. Trevor, his face pale with fear, turned back toward the altar, his eyes wide as the dark mist began to coalesce into a single terrifying form. It took shape slowly, like a figure emerging from a nightmare. Tall, imposing, its body wreathed in shadows with glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an ancient, cruel intelligence. The figure stepped forward, its movements deliberate, the shadows twisting around it like living creatures. It towered over us, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. This was no mere ghost or lost soul. It was something far older, something that had been trapped here for centuries, waiting for fools like us to set it free. We need to do something, Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with fear. We can't just stand here. But what could we do? We were trapped in the heart of the asylum, surrounded by ancient forces we didn't understand. Every step we took seemed to bring us closer to the darkness. And the figure, whatever it was getting closer. Jack, his face pale with panic, turned toward the altar, where the last of the symbols were still flickering weakly. The symbols, he shouted. They were meant to trap it, right? Maybe we can use them. How? I asked, glancing at the carvings, my mind racing. We don't know what they mean. Trevor hesitated, his eyes darting between the mist and the glowing symbols. Maybe it's not about understanding them. Maybe we just need to activate them. Like a lock. We woke it up. Maybe we can put it back. The figure's shadowy form loomed closer, the mist around it thickening. Its glowing eyes locked onto us, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to fall to my knees, to give in to whatever ancient force was at work here. But I fought it, clinging to the last shred of hope. Do it, I shouted, turning toward Jack. Activate the symbols. Try something. Jack nodded, his hands trembling, as he ran toward the altar. He placed his hands on the flickering symbols, trying to press them, to trace their shapes. But nothing seemed to happen. The glow of the symbols was fading fast, and the figure was almost upon us, its shadows spreading like a dark wave across the floor. It's not working, Jack cried, desperation clear in his voice. I don't know how to. Before he could finish, the mist surged forward, tendrils of shadow wrapping around him and dragging him to the ground. Jack screamed, thrashing as the darkness enveloped him, pulling him toward the altar. The figure's eyes flared with a terrible light as it watched, its form growing stronger as it fed on the fear and chaos around it. Jack, I shouted, lunging toward him, but Trevor grabbed my arm, pulling me back. No, it's too late, Trevor shouted, his voice thick with fear. We need to focus on the symbols. The room shook violently as the figure advanced, and the remaining symbols on the walls began to flicker out one by one. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of dark magic, and I knew deep down that if we didn't act now, None of us would leave this place alive. Sarah, her face pale but determined, rushed to the altar beside Jack, her hands shaking as she traced the remaining glowing symbols. "Come on," she muttered, her voice cracking with fear. "Please work! Please work!" And then, as if responding to her plea, one of the symbols flared brightly, pulsing with energy. The figure paused, its shadowy form recoiling slightly, as the light from the symbol grew brighter, stronger. "It's working!" I shouted, hope surging through me. "Keep going!" Sarah and Trevor frantically traced the remaining symbols, and with each one that lit up, the figure seemed to weaken, its shadowy form flickering like a dying flame. But it wasn't enough. The figure let out a deafening roar, the sound shaking the very foundations of the chamber. The mist surged forward again, swirling violently as it tried to extinguish the glowing symbols. The room was filled with a blinding light as the last of the symbols ignited, pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. Then, with a final desperate scream, the figure collapsed in on itself, its shadowy form dissipating into the mist. The air crackled with power as the mist was sucked back into the altar, the stone ceiling shut with a thunderous boom. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. We had won. But at what cost? We stood there staring at the altar, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a suffocating blanket. Jack was gone, consumed by the darkness we had unleashed. The asylum had claimed another life, and though we had survived, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only delayed the inevitable. "Let's get out of here," Trevor said quietly, his voice hoarse, "before something else wakes up." Without another word, we turned and made our way toward the exit, the air still thick with the lingering presence of the evil we had barely escaped. As we left the chamber, the symbols on the walls dimmed and faded, leaving behind only the cold, dark stone. But even as we walked away, I could feel it, the whispering of the walls, the eyes of the shadows watching us. The asylum wasn't done with us yet.